You are listening to the Think Brick Australia podcast. Think Brick Australia represents the clay, brick and paver manufacturers of Australia. Brick by brick, our podcast will discuss technical information and architectural case studies with special guests. I'm your host, Elizabeth McIntyre, the CEO of Think Brick Australia. On today's podcast, this has been a podcast that I've actually been waiting patiently to do for a very long time, even though the architect that I'm currently interviewing has always been on call for any of my questions or requests. It gives me great pleasure to say hello after her house to Fooi Ling Khoo from Oof Architecture.
Hello, Elizabeth.
I will just admit that we forgot to press record. So we've done 20 minutes of chatting and now we've really got to start again.
Well, we're well warmed up,
We're warmed up. We're ready to go. And I think what I wanted to let the audience know is that ever since, it was probably before 2015, maybe around 2012 or 2013, you entered into our awards or you were at one of the ceremonies. And ever since then, we've collaborated on a number of things. And some of those things have been you obviously designing beautiful brick houses and buildings. But you've also come and spoken to our members at our roadshow breakfasts. And you've even come to Adelaide. And I think you can admit...
Think Brick took me to Adelaide when I'd never been there. So I am grateful for that because I did feel very embarrassed that I'd never been there before.
And all of our South Australians would know how much it is such a brick city. So we're glad that we, I guess, embellished your knowledge on that. But we also did, for a couple of our awards nights, a tour of Richmond and its surrounds of all the beautiful brick buildings. And you did that for us as well. And now here you are on the podcast. We were worried last time you might have COVID, but you don't.
Yes.
So we're here. So before we get talking a little bit more about bricks and your buildings, maybe you could just describe your childhood and where you grew up.
Yeah, sure. I was born in Malaysia, in a place called Georgetown in Penang that I think a lot of people in Australia may have heard of if they've heard of anything in Malaysia, because it's a beach holiday town. So if you've actually been for holidays in Malaysia, quite likely you'll end up in Penang, a beautiful tropical sort of like beach island. But there was also an Australian Air Force base close by. So it's sort of been lurking in the back minds of, I think, Australians as a sort of exotic place that they might have heard the name of before. But it's a very interesting city. Penang was originally a British colony.
See, I did not know that. But now
so it's a colonial city and it's got beautiful colonial architecture as well as, combinations of all sorts of things. And it's always been, for hundreds of years, I guess the part of the trading routes that went from Britain and India to China.
Yeah.
So everyone passed, like all sorts of people of all sorts of reasons, all sorts of trades sort of passed through there. And some people stayed, some people moved on. So as a result, it's always been this place which has been a melting pot, literally, of everything. So there are all sorts of different people there. There's sort of Chinese, Malaysian, Indians, Indian, Chinese, European, whatever's. It's just all sorts of people from all different places. The food is fantastic because of that. So the influence from all through Southeast Asia sort of coming through that area, as well as, European influences, Indian, obviously, Chinese, obviously, that is why it is a food mecca. And I think we started talking about, got lost in the delights of hawker food before, like the hawker stall kind of culture there.
Yeah. And that is the street
food. Amazing. Yeah, the street food is fantastic. And I think quite a few people go there for an eating holiday.
Wow. Well, that sounds good to me.
I would do that myself. And if you met any people from Penang, they do. And, this is someone else sort of mentioned this the other day. You'll spend every meal talking about what you're going to eat next or what you ate before.
So what are your 3 most recommended dishes if we've got people thinking about it?
Well, if you're in Penang, I think one of the things that you should try is what they call the Penang laksa or an Assam laksa, which is not like the laksa that people get here. What people commonly call laksa here is actually what in Malaysia is called curry mee, which is basically just a curry soup, kind of like noodle. That's commonly what everyone thinks it is.
Right.
But laksa in Penang is actually quite different, but it's also another like really yummy soup noodle dish. So it's made from rice noodles, but it's in a fish and seafood broth with ginger flour and pineapple and all sorts of other sort of like fresh, there's a fresh zingy sort of herby, citrusy seafood type of soup. It is delicious.
Oh.
Yeah, that's always good. Char kway
Okay.
teow is always good. Ice kacang, which is a dessert of shaved ice with condensed milk and red beans. And, actually you can choose your toppings, but rose syrup,
Yes,
what we were talking
which
about
we've-
before,
I've just
and
been
condensed
generously
milk.
offered. Yes.
So anything with like too much sugar is not enough, goes on top of the shaved ice, and it is fantastic. In a hot, sticky Penang day, it is a child's paradise delight.
And when you're growing up, were there lots of siblings, lots of family, or?
Well, my particular family is relatively modest. I've got one brother and one sister, but my parents had huge families. So one of them has 10 brothers and sisters, the other one has 9 brothers and sisters. So I had uncles and aunts and cousins like everywhere growing up in Malaysia. And although my family lived on the mainland, about an hour or so sort of away from Penang, in a town called Alor, every weekend we spent in Penang at my grandfather's house, which was the great patriarchal sort of clan house, and with just uncles and aunts and cousins and just like, mayhem every weekend with this huge family. It's fantastic.
Well, I'm imagining there must have been lots of kids. What sort of games were you playing? Or were you playing, or were you just...
Oh, I'm not sure what we're... Just all sorts of things and nothing. Like, the way the kids just... Well, I mean, the fantastic thing was that it was quite a big house, as in with a big garden. And so our parents would just be like, go.
Yeah.
And the kids, there'd be an army of kids rampaging around the house, and we'd make up games as we went along. So it's all fun things like poking each other with sticks, or hide and seek, or treasure hunts, or whatever else. So we did all sorts of things. We were like, we did dangerous things every now and then. I do remember falling from a first floor stair off a landing because I decided I was an astronaut.
Yep.
Gravity wasn't really part of my understanding of things at that time, but I was wearing a space helmet, which is maybe why I can still talk today.
So when did you come to Australia, and what prompted the move, I guess?
My parents migrated to Australia in, I think it was about 1978. So I was about 10.
Yep.
And part of the reason why they moved was that, even though Malaysia is a fantastic place in many ways, it also does have, considerable issues, particularly around race. And not long after I was born, there were huge anti-Chinese riots in Malaysia.
Right. Yeah.
And I think that would have been one of the key reasons why my parents, I think, started making plans to actually go somewhere else at that time. And there'd been riots before that. So it's one of those, I was going to say it's a cultural issue, but in a lot of ways it's not. I think it's something that's whipped up for political reasons. Yeah. But anyway, there are sort of issues with the, I guess, minority sort of ethnic groups in Malaysia, and there's conflict that's been, I think, whipped up by the government, basically.
Yeah, about 18 months ago, I read Lee Kuan Yew's From Third World First, which is obviously about Singapore. And I'd studied Singapore when I was at school, but it was eye-opening to me to understand all those different minority groups that were also on the fringes of Singapore.
Yes.
And he was sort of dealing with a lot of those issues. And I can imagine. Yeah.
And I think it's part of the colonial history as well as sort of like general history of that area where, Chinese, like from China, would have been sort of coming through all those areas in Southeast Asia, forever.
Yep.
And so, and in terms of, I guess, those communities establishing in other people's countries, other people's lands, I guess there's always been, conflict between like the people that were always there and the people that sort of like moved in, and then the dynamics of those things. And then the British colonial history, I think, didn't help, because what they were very good at was actually seeing where those ethnic conflicts were and elevating one group above the other group, because they could get their loyalty from this group,
that's right,
against the other group, the sort of thing. So there's a lot of those dynamics there. Anyway, the sum result is that my parents decided to migrate.
Yes.
And they decided to come to Australia because before that, one of the great programs that had been running in Southeast Asia was what they called the Colombo Plan, which was the scholarship system for students to come from Southeast Asia to come and study in Australia, sort of at universities. So there was a sort of a link with Australia for, I think, quite a lot of people in Southeast Asia. So not necessarily through the Colombo Plan, but some of my relatives and my dad did actually study in Australia, or in Brisbane in particular.
Yes.
They went to Queensland University in the 50s. One of my uncles studied at Melbourne Uni. And the stories I heard from them about what Australia was like in the 50s is pretty amazing.
Wow.
You know, being Chinese was really strange in 1950s Australia.
Yeah.
They said people used to just almost like drop their bags in the street to stare at them walking across the road. They were so exotic. But yeah, anyway, I guess within my family then there was this link to Australia.
Yes.
So migrating here was sort of made sense to them because we had some family here already. Some of my aunts also had come to high school here, so there was this sort of a link here.
Yeah, there was some familiarity.
Yes.
And then what were your earliest memories of Brisbane? I mean, that's where you spent the first part of your time in Australia.
Yes. I thought Brisbane actually is a fantastic place to grow up. I think when we were there, Brisbane was a lot smaller then. It was definitely still at that time. Joe Bjelke-Petersen was still Premier and had been for decades already before we got there probably. But it did definitely feel like that small town that Brisbane was, which Brisbane is not anymore by any means. But it did have that little bit of an outpost kind of like town at that time. We grew up in the suburbs. It was fantastic suburbs. I had lots of friends that lived in the area, also other family in these beautiful sort of hills. And I do always remember the beautiful Queenslander houses. My parents, of course, refused to get one.
What did they get?
Because the maintenance on a timber house, they just thought it was a nightmare. And you know what? They got a nice brick house in the suburbs as a result because they thought that would be... We're going to get established in Brisbane. We need to have a solid sort of forever house.
Yeah.
So they went with cream brick.
Cream brick
in the suburbs.
And Fooi, what stands out to you as the differences in Australia coming from Malaysia?
Well, I think as a kid, when I first came here, I was astounded by the school system because going to school in Malaysia was very full on.
Really?
It was really full on. My parents actually sent me to a Chinese school. So there were normal sort of state schools and stuff like that would be Malay based. And my father in particular was very keen for me to go to a Chinese school so that I would be learning Chinese, learning Mandarin and English as a second language. Although I've got to say, as far as languages are concerned, like we spoke English. I've spoken English forever because in Malaysia, I mean, this is going back to that idea of it being a melting pot place. Like we were surrounded by people from everywhere.
Yes.
So very often English was the connector. Yeah, where, you go, well, I don't really speak Hindi, but, my friend down the road, they blah, 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 but everyone would sort of speak English at some point. So I already knew English, so that's fine. But I think my father in particular just had a strong idea about trying to maintain, I guess, a Chinese heritage.
Sure.
But the culture of education was quite different. So I went to school. This is even when I was quite, young. And when I finished school, I would go to tutoring.
Oh, wow.
So even this was when I was very young, like as in grade 1, 2, 3 kind of thing. So, but that was just considered normal.
Okay.
And then when I came to Australia, it was like, oh, is that it? Like I could just go home and have fun. Like I'd always do my homework because I'm swotty, but that was not that big a deal. Yeah, so the actual life was more chilled out and relaxed, and there was less emphasis on things like rote learning, I guess.
Okay.
So we didn't have to we used to, in Malaysia, the teachers loved to get us to sit down and recite times tables and things like that. We didn't quite do that so much. Although I must say, I was quite advanced in maths compared to the other kids here when I first arrived.
Yeah.
But that may have made me lazy because I think I just cruised. I didn't stay ahead. I just cruised until they caught up and then went, oh no.
So during that time at school, what made an impression on you that related to where you are now, architecture? Was there anything?
I'm not sure that there was. I guess maybe more in high school there was, we had actually some great art teachers and art facilities, and I loved art. But part of that also was they teach us the history of architecture as well, which sort of just, I don't think at the time I was particularly interested in it. I was interested in all of art history, but just having that sort of in the background as well, like there's a familiarity, I guess, with architectural history. It's kind of woven into just the history of everything.
Yes.
That because I sort of did it at school, it's just sort of, in my understanding of world history is actually architectural history as well. I'll link it back to these things. So there's sort of some of that. And also sometimes I think of the old state school, Indooroopilly State School that I went to in Brisbane when we first came to Australia, which was just your typical state school, sort of like timber school buildings. But the standard model there was that the classrooms were upstairs and then underneath was just all open. And so, which was sort of like those Queenslander houses in a way. So playing on the stairs, running up and down the stairs, but also in the undercrofts. So in this beautiful sort of cool shade, you know, on a hot Brisbane day, and just running around like mad in those timber buildings. I still remember those really well. And I still love those, you know, the idea of those places, that you're sort of inside, outside. There were no sort of corridors as such. You waited on the veranda before you sort of went into the classroom. So you were always sort of outside, inside.
Yes.
Which I love that.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, you can't do that so much in Melbourne.
Well, we've just seen how much you try, so...
Yeah. Yes, we have an outside
kitchen. And we're here on a day at 36-degree heat. It's beautiful and cool because it's a brick.
Correct.
Building.
This is a triple brick building.
Yes.
It's a very, very old block of flats. So, yes, brick forever.
So, you finish high school and then what happens?
Yeah, well, going to university was not an option.
Okay.
We just did.
Yeah. Oh, okay.
Because it's a classic sort of, I think, Asian migrant expectation from the parents. Like, you don't choose whether you want to go to university or not. That's just what you're doing. And then, of course, all through school, I guess it was the classic thing of like, well, of course you would do academically well. They'd expect nothing less than top grades. So in some ways, that kind of, I guess that sort of parental pressure was still always there, but it meant that you could pick and choose.
Okay.
Because you had those choices of what you wanted to do at uni.
So what did you pick?
Look, I ended up picking architecture, and I say ended up because I think maybe unlike some other architects who had a clearer vision of what they wanted to do before, that's why they chose to do architecture at university level. I think I ended up not so much choosing architecture as crossing off the other things, and that was what was left.
Wow.
Because I didn't want to do medicine, which is always the prime candidate for like an Asian family. It's like, of course, you're going to do medicine, which I didn't quite make the grades. I just slightly was off. And the next best thing that they thought would be great would be doing dentistry. Oh. So not interested. Sorry, dentists out there. It's important work. Someone's going to do it, but it wasn't going to be me.
But it is extraordinary the responses I've had to that question, because not everyone is as planned out as you think. And for some people they chose it by default, and you're brilliant. So
and it's left over. And I think in some ways I discovered what it was when I started it. I was so clueless.
What was that experience like for you at university? Was it a positive one or?
I think it was positive. I mean, I certainly enjoyed it. I don't think I was a very good student. I think after
it feels like you peaked early. You peaked when you were 5 years old.
I know. You kind of go, well, maybe because I worked so hard at school.
Yeah.
I got to uni and suddenly the formal sort of school structure sort of fell away a bit.
Yeah.
And clearly I hadn't developed too much or enough self-discipline, and I had a great time at uni. I loved, but I don't think my studies were especially of a high standard, although I met lots of great people that I really loved.
And so...
But I did enjoy it.
Yeah.
I guess that's the thing. I mean, I was also massively stressed by it.
Yeah.
Because this is probably what a lot of the architects will have said as well, like the sort of learning structure that you go into is this sort of design studio type culture where you're given projects to work on, design projects, from the very first day. And then also from the very first day, you have a deadline, a due date, and that's when you make a presentation to the entire class of what you've done. Mm. So there was this constant thing of like, there was no hiding in the background of, oh, dog ate my homework, I've got nothing to show, or oh, it's not good enough or whatever. It's just like, shut up and do it. You know, and that sort of discipline of constantly, whatever you're up to, you have to get up and talk about it and then take the feedback, kind or unkind, from your lecturers and tutors, other students sometimes, and actually learn to deal with that. And I think most people find that extremely stressful, especially when you're starting out. It's pretty full on. Yeah.
And did you travel at all whilst you were studying during that time?
Not in my early years at uni, because I just didn't have any money to do it. So I didn't go. I think I went overseas for the first time when I was about 25. So I go to Europe for the first time. I sort of like travelled, I guess, on my own.
And then when you finished uni, what did you do? What was one of your first
Well, it took me a long time to do uni, because I was one of those nightmare students as far as university was concerned I did 1.5 years and then I deferred for a year.
And
you
so went to all the parties, didn't you? Yeah.
Yeah, and worked in it. But the good thing was I worked in an architect's office. At least I had my head screwed on enough to do something sensible. So I actually knew what the work was.
Okay.
And then went back and did another year and a half. And then I moved interstate. So I changed universities and worked down here for a while, and then went overseas for a while, traveling, and worked overseas for a little while, and then sort of came back and then sort of finished my degree. So I think it took me about 9 years.
Wow.
To do what is already a long degree.
Yes, but you wanted to inhale it all. So when you went overseas, I'm just curious, as an architectural student, where did you go and what did you notice?
Of course, the grand architectural tour.
Yes.
Which after, sitting in architectural history lectures for years and looking at all these pictures of buildings, to actually be able to go to these places, it was very exciting. So I went to Rome, which was amazing and which I still love, but travelled around in Italy, and I think it was a round the world trip. So I was in Germany, in France, in the UK, and and also went to the United States as well, sort of on the way back. So this big sort of like world tour, I guess, of the Western world, let's say. So we didn't really go to Asia sort of on that trip. It was very exciting, and it was very, I guess, also a real revelation in terms of just realizing how much difference there is between what you think you know about a place, what you can learn in a book, what you can learn in sort of like photographs and images, and what the place actually is, actually being there. And I think that has still always sort of stuck with me, like just the difference between those things, like the physical experience of actually really being somewhere as opposed to just representations of that, which, technology is pretty amazing these days, and the amount of information you can get on the net is astounding, but being there, like there's nothing like it.
It's true. You mentioned that you were working for an architectural firm, and did you continue working for them once you finished?
Actually, I worked in quite a few places by the time I graduated, because, there was the time that I stopped studying for a little while, had it deferred. I worked for a firm in Brisbane, Staccato McGrain. I wonder if they're still around. I should get in touch with them. I used to do a lot of colouring in for them. It was in the old days. This is before computer rendering. I used to actually use, listen up, kids, colour pencils. Colour pencils.
Do you remember
those
the carbon copy things where you actually get to run it through? I think I was trying to explain that to my children the other day.
Yes, and actually drafting with pencils and pens, which I've got to say, in a Queensland humid atmosphere, all the Queensland architects will identify with this, is the humidity is a nightmare. On the tracing paper. Not only do you stick to it, but also if you accidentally leave an object on the drawing overnight, and you come back the next morning, the whole sheet will have warped around it because it sucked in the moisture from the air. Yeah. All that sort of stuff. The bad old days, actually, I'm happy to leave them behind. Okay. It was a nightmare, that stuff. I'm so happy to work on computers. But sort of worked in various places in Melbourne. Actually, the first office that gave me a position in Melbourne was McGorran Soon, who are actually called McGorran Giannini Soon now. But at the time, it was, when I first came to Melbourne, it was in the middle of the recession in the 90s. And apparently at that time, it was like a quarter of architects were like working in sandwich shops or driving taxis and stuff.
Finding out through this podcast.
Like terrible, it was so awful. And there were no jobs at all. And it took me ages. I just went through the phone book because I didn't know anyone in Melbourne. And so I was very lucky to have got a position with that firm because they were fantastic.
Yep.
And I still have, keep in touch with them today. And, I feel really lucky because they were real mentors. And Rob McGorran, who I still keep in touch with, is, they really looked after their students there and saw the bigger picture of like the design world and the industry that they would be coming into and their role in sort of bringing up people sort of into the stuff. I mean, it's fantastic, really. Not all places, are that, generous, and they were great.
How did it, I guess, influence how your career shaped from there?
Yeah, well, I think that sense of generosity and understanding of the big picture, I think, has always sort of stayed with me. Certainly, the idea about like no matter what project you're working on, and this is like whether it's a chicken shop or a house or a skyscraper or whatever, they're all part like of a bigger fabric of everything. So not just built environment, but cultural and social and like everything. All these networks sort of woven together is what the buildings are. And so they're not objects in their own right, or it's not yeah, it's not right to actually think of them as just sort of individual sculptures in their own universe. They're part of this like much larger world, you know, and I still think that. And so no matter how small the project that you do or how big, it's still part of all of this sort of stuff. And then the understanding that is actually what makes good projects, I think.
And how did you come to begin OOF? What led you to that?
Man, most architects who will have started their own practices will have come to this point, whereas you just don't want to ask anyone else whether something's okay anymore. Okay. You just don't need a director's approval for what you're doing at some point. Yep. And you just want to be captain of your own ship. No matter how small, it doesn't matter if it's a dinghy, as long as it's yours. And I think I got to the point where, even though I'd loved a lot of the offices that I worked with, I met so many fantastic people, you know, had the opportunity to be involved with fantastic projects, but I just like doing my own thing.
Okay. Now, looking back on when you first started, is there a particular project that you look back and you think of it fondly, or you want to cry, or all of the above?
Yeah, I think some of the very early projects I still cringe about a bit, because I think when you're a young architect and you're just starting out, it's the classic thing of like, you get one project and you're trying to fit every bloody idea you ever had in the universe, like in that one project. It's so stupid. And it takes a while to get that out of your system. And I think some of my early jobs are like that, where you're just trying to push things too hard. They're too complicated. You're not understanding the parameters of what people need. You know, you're thinking about yourself. You're not thinking about them.
Yep.
You know, all that sort of thing. Like, you just can't get yourself sorted for a while, I think, because you're just so overexcited about.
I think that it's a common theme what I've learned.
Yes, it's just like overcomplicated, just thinking in the wrong way. And it takes a while to actually realize what I'm striving for is some sort of clarity about seeing those things.
Yeah.
You know, and also that the client, they are the reason why you can make the work. Like, the work doesn't exist without them.
Yeah.
You can't design something without them. You know, and just realizing sort of how valuable the client is, not in terms of like, yes, they pay the bills. I mean, yeah, we make a living sort of with clients, but it's also just as part of, I think, the creative process. You know, what a huge part they are, like responding to them.
Yes.
You know, that is how the work, I mean, for me anyway, that is how the work is made. Like, if I didn't have a client, there would be no project. Nothing would happen. Like, nothing would happen because I'm not an artist. You know?
So if we then move to Hello House, which obviously caught our eye, and I think, though, at the time it was one of the best examples of corbelling, although I have to put a preface on this because I think Mel Bright had started
Mel Bright
before.
did have a very nice building on that.
Yes, and she has claimed that she started the trend. You continued it in a loud way, but maybe just talk to us about how that came about.
Yes, I do remember seeing Mel's project, but I think I might have seen it actually a little bit after. And but there was
suggesting you copied it.
It's like, sorry, Mel.
Yeah.
You are inspirational, but
Yes.
not in that particular case. It was actually some Dutch work.
I remember you
that I
telling
was
us
looking
you saw
at.
a photo or
Yeah,
something. Yeah.
that there was, which I did eventually on my world. I did see sort of when I went on my first world trips. I did go to Holland, but this is another great place for brick tourism. Is the Netherlands. Like, amazing history of brickwork, right? Historic stuff to the contemporary stuff, and the contemporary work is really beautiful. So there were a few of those contemporary Dutch buildings, houses in particular, that I loved, and they used some of that corbelling, especially that sort of toothing at the corners. Yes. I love that. So I was so excited to have the chance to actually use it at Hello House. But Hello House is so one in more than even most projects, I think, was a stronger collaboration with the client. Because one of our clients, the artist, Rose Nolan, and a lot of her work is about super graphics and huge fonts, sort of building size fonts actually, that is got to do with the form of the letters themselves as part of the graphic nature of it, as well as the message of what it says. But also what Rose was really interested in, which I loved as well, was the idea of sort of handcraft and hand making things. And, you know, brickwork in that case was just such a perfect marriage of those things, because in making the super graphic, it was still about the makingness of that particular material of bricks and the bricklayer and the making of it by hand. I guess you'd sort of look at it, it's almost like a cartoony thing, like, this massive sort of text of hello, but it's actually made, very precisely by a person, brick by brick, in the most primal way, the way that, ancient buildings were ever done. Like, the technique has not been very different. I mean, obviously it can be refined, but it's not in principle different from what people would have done in ancient times, which I also love the idea. I mean, part of the reason why I love brick there as well, because it was sort of ancient, but also it was like pixelation as well in digital images. So that idea of little units of things that make up a larger sort of like pixelated image. So, they had a lot of resonances of all those different things, which made it it was like a great object in itself.
Yeah, did you choose the material, or was that the client, or was it
No, I chose the material as a way of making hello, which is what Rose actually suggested. Why don't we just say hello? I mean, we'd been through all these different ways about how to make that ball, what it was supposed to do, what its role was, and this and that and the other thing. And it was such a simple thing that she'd said that just solved every single problem that we had. It was fantastic. And so in terms of the brickwork and how that was done, there are all those things that we just, I just talked about, but also the neighbourhood she was in, in the middle of Richmond. It's a brick neighbourhood, but it's all bricks of all different sorts. So there's, 19th century sort of Victorian bricks. There's 1950s kind of cream brick down the road. There's classic 1970s kind of Besser block kind of number with the gum trees out the front. I think you might have seen those. So it's all these little masonry sort of experiments in that little neighbourhood, and this was our contribution to the bricks.
I remember you telling me, because this is a cream brick, and it is now, a couple of years ago, but you had a lot of algae problems with it.
Yeah, it was the vanadium.
Vanadium
staining coming through. And actually, this is where Mel Bright comes in.
Yes.
Because Mel's project, I think, had a similar issue because they'd use also a very light brick. Mm-hmm. And they had with Bowral,
yes,
I think, sort of developed a tech sheet.
Right.
Or had been developing a tech sheet about how to deal with the vanadium staining, which I was very grateful for, because this green stuff, this bright green splodges were coming up on the brickwork, and we're all just like, oh my God, what is it? What's going on? The builder was freaking out.
But we solved it.
Yeah, in terms of the cleaning regime, just made sure that, it was using sort of mild cleaners, not going crazy. And ultimately what solved it was just letting it settle into the environment so that the balance of the moisture sort of around and in the brick sorted itself out, so this stuff sort of stopped leaching through. Yeah, which was great, having that technical information to sort of work with, and to actually step back and just go, don't panic and don't start using crazy stuff, because that actually exacerbates the problem.
That's if you use
so it was actually great knowing, like, not to
don't
go crazy.
We know that, and often we get people called up when that's happened, and then it's too late sometimes. You, after that, you won the category for Horbury Hunt Residential. And
hooray!
And then you also participated in our jury. I just wondered, what's your perspective on the Think Brick Awards? Because you've sort of seen it from all angles. The pun.
Well, it was great fun to be on a jury, actually, because, the other jurors are such fun. They were fantastic people, and it was really great being able to discuss architecture with other architects in a critical way, because you're trying to evaluate projects and talk about what you think's, which ones does which one better. But then also, I guess, in that discussion, trying to understand what, in terms of the other architects, like what they thought architecture should try to be and what not. And what I actually found was interesting was that state by state, there was actually quite a different perspective on what architects thought work should be trying to do. And that's always interesting, like, as an intellectual sort of like discussion, the priorities should be so different when in all other respects in Australia, you kind of go, well, whether Australians are from Brisbane or Sydney or Perth or whatever, kind of the same, really. And it's just small things that are different, like details about maybe some language things or whatever, but there's not even a different accent. That we don't have differences the way that Europeans have differences, for example.
But it is interesting, because I think I didn't know any better when I was pulling the jury together. And I think one of the things about our jury and the awards themselves is that with the Institute of Architects Awards, as I understand it, it's sort of like a regional, state, and then goes to national. Whereas all of our projects are all in
always
the same
national.
thing. Yeah, always national. And, you know, you get this insight into what everyone's doing. There's no real semi-finals or finals. So, and then that sort of always has come through in the jury.
Yeah, and you can see it in the work as well. The, you know, work from, you know, say New South Wales work or Queensland work or Victorian work or Western Australia work. That you can see that some work in some states just wouldn't have happened really somewhere else. I mean, not in a weird sort of, I guess, formal way of it looks weird or something, but it's more just the attitude, you know, that you can see in the work, and it's actually quite different. And I was actually surprised that, for example, in Victoria, it seems to me that there's actually a lot more interest in maybe non-architectural ideas being brought into architecture.
Okay.
And also maybe more room for more exuberant sort of decorative uses of colourful things, and which is sort of sounds strange because you think, oh, that should be Queensland, shouldn't it? Because we all wear black here. But I think in Victoria or in Melbourne, there's certainly more room for a postmodern kind of attitude to architecture. And I find that in Queensland a bit, but in New South Wales, there's sort of more dedicated modernists. They're more pared back, and they're more austere, kind of simple, sort of robust. And don't write in. All my friends in, you know, in Brisbane and Sydney, please don't write in and complain about what I just said.
What's your sort of thoughts on, I guess, both the role of brick, or where you see that going? You're obviously a brick lover, as I love to refer to you as. But where do you see the role of architects in what's happening with the world at the moment?
Well, certainly one of the key things that I think there's been a lot of good initiatives going on is around, you know, ideas about what to do about climate change, so what to do about sustainability, and not just freaking out at the hugeness of the challenge, because you know, we have all got ourselves into a really massive, terrible bind, like globally. And Australia has been actually embarrassingly slow in actioning anything. But, you know, instead of sort of worrying about the big picture, like, you know, that's too big for you to sort of handle, I think there's, in terms of architectural work, there is sort of a day-by-day practice thing that you can do. Like, what do you build in? What do you build? How much do you build? You know, all those sorts of things have long-term impacts because, yes, it's the resources that go into making buildings, which is huge. So, you know, the construction industry and the built environment are a massive sap on resources. And so, you know, one of the things that we can obviously do is just be smart in the use of resources. Like, don't be wasteful. Like, don't be stupid with the riches that we have, because in Australia, we're so lucky to have, you know, the resources that we have, but just stop pissing it away. You know, actually value them properly. And they can be done in all sorts of ways in terms of the construction, but essentially it's actually got to do with how much you build, like what you build, and don't throw things away. You know, so I love the idea of recycling buildings and adapting buildings. I love working with older buildings, and essentially I just do residential work pretty much. So almost all my work is in working with existing buildings and altering, and every now and then there's a chance to do an all new building, but even then that sort of sits in quite often older suburbs, but very often working with older buildings. But just, you know, the idea of like, don't demolish if you don't need to, you know, just don't go nuts, because buildings are not a throwaway thing. And we need to, I think, really get that into our heads. And on every level of government, we also need to make sure that that is actually in their heads. Wholesale demolition should never be allowed. If you want to get rid of something, there's got to be a reason for it. At the moment, we have no reason. No one asks you. It's like it's your as of right to just basically put things in landfill. And the amount of resources that buildings take up, you can't do that.
And it's, you know, fascinating what you're saying, because it is being echoed by the new generation of architects.
Yes.
You know, we've interviewed them and they say the same thing. Rather than looking at a building and thinking, can we demolish it and rebuild it? Now it's more, how can we enhance it, or
how do we work with it?
Work with what's there. So.
And I think often it's actually better. I mean, I love the dynamic between like the old and the new parts of the building, and that often it makes both of them better. And it's a lot of fun, you know, in terms of just design work. to look at the relationships between these two things. It's part of what makes it really fun, the relationship. And I've heard people, the architect Carlo Scarpa, of course, and people have accused him of as if you could accuse him of any design weakness, but, he does superb work, but his best work is with existing buildings, like altering and adapting and extending existing buildings. And in terms of his best work, it's like the dynamic between the two things and his response to that kind of conversation between the old and the new buildings, that really makes extraordinary work that he brings together. Where he's actually built a building from scratch, I know I've read some people have been very critical of his work because they've gone, he doesn't really know what to do here, And so in some ways, some people suggest that he almost like builds a structure and then designs another one that responds to that one because he doesn't know how to, where to go when it's a blank piece of paper. But also, certainly in terms of houses, living in a place that's just got layers and layers of like history and other times and other lives and other things. I just think that makes each place so much more interesting and fun rather than looking like a showroom that was made yesterday.
And what would be your final thoughts, advice, I guess, for building in brick and maybe entering the awards?
Well, in terms of entering the awards, I would encourage everyone to. I mean, certainly for me, it was a real revelation in terms of entering the awards because I hadn't thought about doing it.
Yeah.
It just hadn't occurred to me. And it was actually one of the brick reps who actually said, there's this awards program, you should think about, putting it in. And he actually really, David Clacy, if you're listening, he really encouraged me to put the building in. And it didn't occur to me that I should. And I think sometimes architects they're not very good at seeing what other people might find interesting. I mean, I know it sounds really dumb sort of after the fact. It didn't occur to me that other people would be interested in this house. And David was great in encouraging me to do that. And then so when we came to the first awards night, I think it would have been the very first time that we met you, I didn't know anything about the awards night. We were talking about this before. The awards night is a wild night. And I'd never been to one before and we were gobsmacked, right? But there's something about the Brick Awards which was so fun.
Yeah.
And Elizabeth, I think you are definitely responsible. But there's a sensibility about it which is actually really just the enthusiasm and the excitement about being part of the industry, celebrating, the design work because they're design awards, but it's the link into the brick industry as well. So all the brick reps and the companies are there on the night as well. So you sort of share your tables like with all the other brick industry people. And that's really fun. Like we met so many people from all over the place and it's so much fun. And I think in some ways maybe it's why it's more fun than other design awards because you're not just sitting just with the other architects.
Yes.
Even though, of course, that's fun because, you catch up with your mates and that sort of thing. But they're all your existing network of people you already kind of know. And, when you sort of mix it up with the whole thing, I think it's just so fun because it's also the sense of like, well, this is actually what our work links in with. Yeah. Because, the design work is the design work. I mean, it's a piece of paper until it becomes real. And these are the people that make it real. So the builders, the brickies, the people that manufacture the bricks, like the whole thing, all of that makes this thing that was just a piece of paper.
And I think, for my members and more importantly, thank you for acknowledging the sales reps because often they don't know what happens. They go in and sometimes, from what I understand, an architect may not use that brick for 3 or 4 more years.
Yes.
Or for a project that doesn't take place for that long.
Yeah.
And for me, it's always been around how do we close that loop from when the brick is sent out, to when it gets introduced, to when it gets laid, to then it gets built, and then it's, as we like to say, celebrated. But thank you for being part of all of our celebrations of brick.
Oh, no, thank you.
And also for celebrating the material in your designs.
Thanks, Elizabeth. I mean, it's been fantastic to be part of the Think Brick family, I guess, in a certain way, because I think what was actually really fun about the Think Brick Awards was that what I didn't realise, the whole thing of like I didn't realise anything until it sort of happened, is we then were able, to take people on tours and sort of keep in touch with people in the industry. I mean, it's been great. It's really sort of felt like an invitation to be part of like the bigger industry out there that makes the work.
Thank you for accepting it and for being part of it. Thanks, Fooi.
Thanks, Elizabeth. See ya.
If you have enjoyed this podcast, please follow, rate and review our podcast. We are always looking for new ways to think brick. If you have an idea of what you'd like to hear about, there's a link in our show notes to let us know.